Deep in the heart of South America, where civilization ends and the wild begins, scientists have uncovered something that defies everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. The Amazon rainforest, stretching across more than 2 million square miles of untamed wilderness, has always been a repository of secrets. But what researchers discovered in 2023 has left the scientific community stunned, terrified, and questioning whether some mysteries are better left buried. This isn't just another new species discovery. This is something that could rewrite the very foundations of biology, evolution, and our understanding of what it means to be alive. The creature they found doesn't follow the rules. It shouldn't exist, yet it does. And the implications of its existence are so profound that several government agencies have classified the research, leaving only fragments of information scattered across academic journals and whispered conversations in university hallways. Welcome back to Ancient Dreams, where we dive into the mysteries that challenge everything we think we know. I'm your host, and today we're going to explore a discovery so extraordinary that it makes every other Amazon finding pale in comparison. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why this creature has sparked international debates, why certain research facilities have gone into lockdown, and why some scientists are calling for a complete moratorium on further exploration in this particular region of the Amazon. But before we reveal what this creature is and why it's so dangerous, we need to understand the context. We need to journey into the deepest, most unexplored corners of the Amazon, where the line between science and nightmare becomes impossibly thin. The Amazon rainforest is often called the lungs of our planet, but that comparison barely scratches the surface of its true nature. This is a living, breathing ecosystem where evolution has had millions of years to experiment, to push the boundaries of what life can become. Every square mile contains more biodiversity than entire continents elsewhere. Scientists estimate that we've catalogued less than 10% of the species that call this place home. In the remote Mamarawa region, where the Rio Solimões meets tributaries so narrow they don't appear on any map, lies one of the most biodiverse spots on Earth. The water here runs black as midnight, stained by tannins from decomposing vegetation. The canopy above is so dense that at midday, the forest floor exists in perpetual twilight. It's here, in this cathedral of green shadows and ancient silence, that Dr. Elena Vasquez made a discovery that would change her life forever. Dr. Vasquez, a marine biologist from the University of São Paulo, wasn't looking for anything extraordinary when she arrived in Mamarawa in March 2023. Her team was conducting routine biodiversity surveys, collecting water samples, and cataloguing fish species for a conservation project. They'd done this work dozens of times before in similar locations. It was supposed to be a standard 3-week expedition. On the 7th day, something went wrong. The team was working near a lagoon system approximately 200 kilometers from the nearest human settlement. The area was accessible only by narrow boats that could navigate the maze of fallen trees and floating vegetation. As Dr. Vasquez later described in her preliminary report, the water in this particular lagoon exhibited unusual properties. It was warmer than surrounding areas by nearly 15 degrees Celsius, despite no visible thermal vents or geological activity. When they lowered their collection nets into the water, something extraordinary happened. The nets came back up, but they weren't just filled with the typical array of small fish and aquatic invertebrates. Tangled in the mesh was something that shouldn't have been there. Something that made Dr. Vasquez question her own eyesight. At first glance, it appeared to be some kind of jellyfish. Translucent, gelatinous, about the size of a dinner plate. But jellyfish don't live in freshwater Amazon lagoons. They're marine creatures, adapted to saltwater environments. Yet here was something that looked exactly like a jellyfish, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to touch and sound. Dr. Vasquez carefully transferred the specimen to a portable containment unit, following standard protocols for unknown species. But as she watched the creature in its temporary home, she realized this was unlike anything in the scientific literature. The bioluminescent patterns weren't random. They formed complex sequences, almost like a language. And when her research assistant spoke near the container, the patterns changed, as if the creature was responding to human voices. That was just the beginning. Over the next 3 days, the team collected 17 more specimens from the same lagoon. Each one displayed the same impossible characteristics. They appeared to be cnidarians, related to jellyfish and coral, yet they thrived in fresh water. They exhibited complex behavioral patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond what should be possible for such simple organisms. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be learning. The creatures began to synchronize their bioluminescent displays, creating coordinated light shows that pulsed across all 17 specimens simultaneously. When the team played different sounds, from music to human speech to recorded bird calls, the creatures' responses became more sophisticated, more purposeful. It was as if they were developing a communication system in real time. Dr. Vasquez knew she was witnessing something unprecedented. She immediately contacted her colleagues back at the university, transmitting initial photographs and video footage via satellite phone. The response was swift and alarming. Within hours, she received calls from researchers across Brazil, then from international institutions, and finally, from government officials she'd never heard of. Everyone wanted to know the exact location of the discovery. On the 11th day of the expedition, as Dr. Vasquez was preparing to transport the specimens back to São Paulo for detailed analysis, she made another discovery that changed everything. One of the creatures had died overnight, and its body was undergoing a transformation unlike anything in biological literature. Instead of decomposing, the dead specimen was crystallizing. Its translucent flesh was hardening into structures that looked more like mineral formations than organic tissue. Under magnification, these crystals revealed geometric patterns of impossible complexity, fractals within fractals that seemed to extend infinitely inward. But the truly shocking discovery came when Dr. Vasquez tested the water around the crystallizing specimen. The chemical composition had changed dramatically. Trace elements that hadn't been present before were now detectable in significant quantities. Rare earth metals, isotopes that typically only exist in laboratory conditions, and organic compounds that defied classification. It was as if the creature's death was somehow altering the fundamental chemistry of its environment. The team immediately collected water samples from around all the living specimens, and the results were consistent. Each creature was slowly but steadily changing the molecular structure of the water it lived in. They weren't just adapting to their environment, they were actively transforming it. This is when Dr. Vasquez made the decision that would haunt her for months to come. Instead of immediately returning to civilization with her discovery, she decided to investigate the lagoon system more thoroughly. She needed to understand where these creatures had come from and whether there were more of them. What she found in the deeper waters of the lagoon system defied every principle of evolutionary biology she'd ever learned. The creatures weren't just living in the Amazon, they were changing it. And they had been doing so for what appeared to be a very, very long time. The lagoon floor, when examined with sonar equipment, revealed structures that couldn't be natural. Geometric formations stretched across the bottom like an underwater city, built from the same crystalline material that the dead specimen had transformed into. These structures pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns as the living creatures, suggesting they were somehow still active, still alive, despite being mineralized. Carbon dating of samples taken from these formations yielded results that made no scientific sense. Some portions appeared to be thousands of years old, while others seemed to have formed within the last few decades. It was as if time itself moved differently in this place. Dr. Vasquez realized she was looking at evidence of a completely unknown form of life, one that existed in multiple states simultaneously. These creatures could be organic and mineral, individual and collective, ancient and newly formed. They represented a type of existence that challenged every category scientists use to understand life itself. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. As the team prepared to leave the lagoon system, Their equipment began malfunctioning in ways that couldn't be explained by normal environmental factors. GPS units provided conflicting readings. Compasses spun wildly. Radio communications became filled with strange harmonics that seemed to echo the bioluminescent patterns of the creatures. It was as if the very presence of these beings was affecting the electromagnetic properties of the surrounding area. When Dr. Vasquez tried to document these electromagnetic anomalies, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The interference patterns weren't random. They followed the same geometric structures as the crystalline formations on the lagoon floor. The creatures weren't just affecting their immediate environment. They were somehow manipulating electromagnetic fields in ways that modern science couldn't explain. Her team's cameras began capturing images that shouldn't have been possible. Photographs of the water surface showed patterns of light that weren't visible to the naked eye. Complex mandalas of energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the creature's bioluminescence. When they reviewed the footage later, they found frames where the creatures appeared to be in multiple locations simultaneously, as if they existed in several dimensions at once. The implications were staggering. If these beings could manipulate electromagnetic fields, what else were they capable of? And more importantly, how long had they been doing it? Dr. Vasquez made the decision to extend her stay in the lagoon system, despite growing concerns from her university superiors. She needed more time to understand what she was dealing with. But as the days passed, she began to notice changes in her team members that filled her with dread. Her research assistant, Carlos, started experiencing vivid dreams about underwater cities and beings of living light. He would wake up speaking in languages he didn't recognize, drawing symbols that matched the patterns they'd observed in the creature's displays. When questioned about these episodes, Carlos claimed no memory of them, yet the drawings were unmistakably in his handwriting. Dr. Vasquez herself began experiencing similar phenomena. She found herself understanding the creature's bioluminescent communications without conscious effort, as if the patterns were directly uploading information into her mind. The knowledge she gained this way was unlike anything in scientific literature. She learned that these beings existed in what could only be described as a collective consciousness, sharing memories and experiences across vast distances and potentially across time itself. Through this unnatural communion, she discovered that the lagoon system was just one node in a vast network that stretched throughout the Amazon basin. The creatures existed in dozens of similar locations, all connected through underground water systems and electromagnetic fields. They had been slowly transforming the chemical composition of the Amazon's waters for centuries, preparing the environment for something she couldn't yet comprehend. The most terrifying revelation came when she realized that the creatures were aware of human presence in ways that defied explanation. They knew about cities thousands of miles away, about deforestation patterns, about climate change, about humanity's impact on their domain, and they were planning a response. On her 18th day at the lagoon, Dr. Vasquez witnessed something that convinced her to immediately terminate the expedition. The 17 specimens in their containment units began exhibiting new behaviors. Instead of their usual synchronized light displays, they started projecting holographic images into the water around them. These weren't simple patterns or random shapes. They were detailed representations of human cities, satellite imagery of deforested areas, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be future scenarios, showing the Amazon completely transformed. In these projections, the rainforest had been replaced by vast crystalline structures similar to those on the lagoon floor. Rivers ran with luminescent water that pulsed with alien intelligence. The sky itself seemed alive with patterns of light that responded to some incomprehensible purpose. And throughout these visions, beings that looked like evolved versions of the jellyfish-like creatures moved through the transformed landscape like gods in their own domain. Dr. Vasquez realized she was witnessing not just a new species, but a new form of life that possessed capabilities humanity was nowhere near ready to understand. These creatures weren't simply living in the Amazon, they were orchestrating its evolution towards something beyond human comprehension. When she tried to document these holographic projections, Her equipment began to malfunction in increasingly dramatic ways. Cameras captured images that showed the lagoon from impossible angles, as if photographed from inside the water and above it simultaneously. Sound recording equipment picked up frequencies that registered as both subsonic and ultrasonic at the same time, creating audio files that caused severe headaches when played back. Most alarming of all, the GPS units began displaying coordinates that placed the team's location in multiple spots across the Amazon basin simultaneously, as if they existed in several places at once. The breaking point came when Carlos disappeared for 6 hours. He was found floating in the lagoon, unconscious but unharmed, his body covered in the same bioluminescent patterns the creatures displayed. When he regained consciousness, he spoke for 30 minutes in a language that linguistic analysis later determined didn't match any known human dialect. The message, when eventually decoded through pattern analysis, contained detailed information about the crystalline structures, the electromagnetic network, and most disturbing of all, specific dates in the near future. According to Carlos's unconscious transmission, the creatures had been monitoring human activity for decades, waiting for the right moment to accelerate their transformation of the Amazon ecosystem. Climate change, deforestation, and industrial pollution had apparently triggered some kind of defensive response. The creatures weren't just adapting to environmental damage, they were preparing to prevent it through methods that would fundamentally alter the nature of life on Earth. Dr. Vasquez made the decision to pack up immediately and return to São Paulo with her specimens and data. But as the team prepared to leave the lagoon system, they discovered that their boat's engines wouldn't start. Electronic systems that had worked perfectly for weeks suddenly failed completely. It was as if the creatures were preventing their departure. For 3 terrifying days, the team was trapped at the lagoon, while their equipment remained mysteriously non-functional. During this time, they observed phenomena that pushed the boundaries of rational explanation. The water level in the lagoon began to rise despite no rainfall or obvious water source. The crystalline formations on the bottom grew visibly larger, extending upward toward the surface. And the creatures themselves began to change, developing new appendages that looked disturbingly similar to human limbs. On the final night of their forced stay, Dr. Vasquez witnessed something that would haunt her dreams for months afterward. All 17 specimens escaped their containment units simultaneously, despite multiple backup security systems. But instead of fleeing into the lagoon, they approached the team's camp, moving through the air above the water's surface like living balloons. As they hovered around the terrified researchers, the creatures began to glow more brightly than ever before, their bioluminescent patterns becoming so intense they illuminated the entire lagoon system. In that ethereal light, Dr. Vasquez could see the true scope of what lay beneath the water. The crystalline structures weren't just formations. They were buildings, roads, entire cities built from living mineral that pulsed with alien intelligence. And rising from these underwater metropolises were more creatures, hundreds of them, each one larger and more complex than the specimens they had collected. These beings moved with obvious intelligence and purpose, arranging themselves in patterns that suggested sophisticated social organization. They had been watching the human researchers all along, studying them just as intently as they themselves were being studied. The message was clear. Humanity was not the dominant intelligence in the Amazon rainforest. The morning after this terrifying encounter brought revelations that would shake the scientific world to its core. As dawn broke over the lagoon, the creatures had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, but they left behind evidence that changed everything Dr. Vasquez thought she knew about the Amazon's hidden depths. The water itself had been transformed overnight. What had been black, tannin-stained liquid now glowed with a faint phosphorescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. When Dr. Vasquez tested the water's composition, the results defied every principle of chemistry she understood. The liquid contained elements that existed in configurations that shouldn't be stable under normal conditions, molecular structures that seemed to bend the laws of physics. But the most shocking discovery came when she realized their equipment was working again. Not just working, but functioning better than it ever had before. GPS units provided coordinates with impossible precision, down to fractions of millimeters. Cameras captured images with resolution far beyond their technical specifications. It was as if the creatures had somehow enhanced their technology rather than sabotaging it. The implications were staggering. These beings possessed the ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level, to alter the fundamental properties of both organic and inorganic materials. They weren't just advanced life forms, they were something approaching technological gods, capable of reshaping reality according to their will. Dr. Vasquez made the difficult decision to leave immediately, but not before collecting samples of the transformed water. As their boats finally started and began the journey back towards civilization, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being allowed to leave rather than escaping on their own terms. The creatures had demonstrated their power, delivered their message, and now they were letting the humans carry that knowledge back to the outside world. The journey back to São Paulo took 4 days, but those 4 days felt like an eternity. The water samples continued to exhibit impossible properties, glowing more brightly at night and seeming to respond to electromagnetic fields from their equipment. Dr. Vasquez began to suspect that the creatures had sent something with them, some kind of ambassador or monitoring device disguised as ordinary lagoon water. Her suspicions proved correct in ways she never could have imagined. Upon arriving at the University of São Paulo, Dr. Vasquez immediately secured the samples in the biology department's most advanced containment facility. The initial analysis revealed that the water was somehow alive, not in the traditional sense of containing microorganisms, but as a unified thinking entity. Under microscopic examination, the liquid showed patterns of organization that resembled neural networks, as if the water itself had developed a form of consciousness. Within hours of beginning her analysis, Dr. Vasquez received visits from researchers she'd never met, government officials who wouldn't identify their agencies, and representatives from international organizations with names she didn't recognize. Everyone wanted access to her samples, her data, her first-hand accounts of what she'd witnessed in the Amazon. The pressure was immense, but Dr. Vasquez refused to share her findings until she better understood what she was dealing with. She had seen enough in the lagoon system to know that humanity was not prepared for the implications of her discovery. These creatures represented a form of life so advanced, so fundamentally different from anything in Earth's evolutionary history, that their existence challenged the very foundations of human civilization. As word of her discovery leaked through academic networks, Dr. Vasquez found herself at the center of a storm she never could have anticipated. Cryptozoologists claimed vindication for their theories about unknown species in the Amazon. Conspiracy theorists suggested government cover-ups and alien contact. Environmental activists argued that the creatures were Gaia's response to human destruction of the rainforest. But the truth was far more complex and terrifying than any of these explanations could capture. Working in secret with a small team of trusted colleagues, Dr. Vasquez began to piece together the full scope of what they had discovered. The creatures weren't just another species sharing the Amazon ecosystem. They were the architects of that ecosystem. For millennia, possibly longer, they had been guiding the evolution of the rainforest, directing its development towards some incomprehensible purpose. The evidence was hidden in plain sight once you knew how to look for it. Certain plant species in the Amazon exhibited genetic modifications that couldn't be explained by natural selection. River systems followed patterns that seemed designed rather than randomly carved by geological processes. Even the behavior of indigenous peoples showed influences that suggested contact with some form of advanced intelligence. The creatures Dr. Vasquez had encountered were not invaders or newcomers to the Amazon. They were its true inhabitants, the intelligence behind its impossible biodiversity and resilience. Humanity had been living alongside this advanced civilization for centuries without ever realizing it. But now that realization was changing everything. The water samples began to exhibit new properties as days passed in the laboratory. They started producing sounds, barely audible frequencies that resonated through the building's structure. sensitive instruments detected electromagnetic emissions that interfered with nearby electronics. Most disturbing of all, researchers working with the samples began reporting shared dreams and inexplicable knowledge about Amazon geography they had never studied. Dr. Vasquez realized that the creatures were using the water as a communication medium, transmitting information directly into the minds of anyone who came into contact with it. The knowledge being shared was vast and alien, containing scientific principles that humanity had not yet discovered, and philosophical concepts that challenged human understanding of consciousness and reality. Through this unnatural education, she learned that the Earth's biosphere was far more interconnected than anyone had imagined. The Amazon wasn't just the lungs of the planet, it was its brain, a living network of intelligence that regulated global climate, ocean currents, and atmospheric composition through mechanisms beyond human comprehension. The creatures she had discovered were nodes in this planetary consciousness, biological supercomputers that processed environmental data and coordinated responses across vast distances and timescales. They had been monitoring human activity for generations, watching as industrial civilization slowly poisoned the systems they had spent eons perfecting. The message transmitted through the transformed water was clear. Humanity had pushed the planetary ecosystem beyond its tolerance limits. The creatures were preparing to take direct action to preserve the biosphere, and that action would fundamentally alter human civilization as we know it. Dr. Vasquez found herself in an impossible position. She possessed knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of life on Earth. But sharing that knowledge might accelerate a conflict between humanity and beings so advanced that the outcome was inevitable. The creatures had demonstrated technological capabilities that made human science look primitive, intelligence that operated on scales humanity couldn't comprehend. And most importantly, they had the patience of geological time on their side. As pressure from government agencies intensified, Dr. Vasquez made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of releasing her findings through traditional academic channels, she began documenting everything in encrypted files, creating a record that could be preserved, regardless of what happened to her personally. The story she told in those files painted a picture of a world on the brink of transformation. The Amazon creatures were not alone. Similar intelligences existed in other ecosystems around the globe, all connected through networks that human science had never detected. The ocean depths harbored civilizations that made the Amazon lagoon seem primitive. Arctic ice contained dormant entities that were beginning to wake as global temperatures rose. Even the desert regions held secrets that challenged human assumptions about where life could exist. All of these intelligences had one thing in common. They were preparing for humanity's next phase of development, whether humanity was ready or not. The transformed water samples continued to serve as a communication link with the Amazon network. Through this connection, Dr. Vasquez learned that the creatures were not malevolent in human terms. They viewed humanity as a young species with potential, but one that had become destructive through ignorance rather than malice. Their intervention would be designed to preserve both human civilization and the planetary ecosystem. But the methods they planned to use would require humanity to accept a fundamentally different relationship with the natural world. Cities would need to be redesigned to integrate with living systems rather than dominating them. Technology would need to be based on biological principles rather than mechanical ones. Human consciousness itself would need to expand to accommodate awareness of the planetary intelligence that had always surrounded us, but remained invisible to our limited perceptions. The timeline for these changes was not measured in years or decades, but in the rhythms of geological transformation. The creatures operated on scales that made human urgency seem irrelevant. They had waited millions of years to reach this point. They could wait a few more centuries for humanity to adapt to the new reality. But adaptation was not optional. The environmental damage caused by industrial civilization had triggered responses throughout the planetary system. Ice caps were not just melting due to global warming. They were being actively transformed by entities that had been dormant for millennia. Ocean currents were shifting according to patterns directed by deep-sea intelligences. Weather systems were becoming increasingly erratic as atmospheric entities awakened to defend their domain. Humanity was experiencing the early stages of a planetary immune response, and the Amazon creatures were just one component of a vast biological defense system that had been activated by our species' impact on the biosphere. Dr. Vasquez realized that her discovery in the Amazon was not an isolated incident, but part of a global phenomenon that was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or understand. The creatures she had encountered were preparing humanity for a transformation that would either elevate our species to a new level of existence or reduce us to a footnote in Earth's evolutionary history. The choice, if it could still be called a choice, was rapidly approaching, and the beings in the Amazon lagoon were not waiting for humanity to decide. Dr. Vasquez's encrypted files revealed disturbing patterns that extended far beyond her Amazon discovery. Government satellites had detected similar electromagnetic anomalies in remote locations across 6 continents. The Mariana Trench exhibited energy signatures identical to those recorded at the lagoon system. Antarctic research stations reported equipment malfunctions that followed the same geometric patterns she had documented. Desert monitoring stations in the Sahara picked up subsonic vibrations that matched the frequencies produced by her water samples. What had seemed like an isolated phenomenon in the Amazon was actually part of a coordinated global awakening. The planetary intelligence was stirring to life, and humanity was running out of time to understand what that meant for our future. The breakthrough came when Dr. Vasquez analyzed the temporal anomalies surrounding her discovery. The creatures hadn't just been manipulating space and matter, they had been manipulating time itself. Carbon dating inconsistencies, GPS malfunctions, and the impossible simultaneity of their existence all pointed to beings that existed outside linear time as humans experience it. Through the water samples, she received fragments of information that painted a picture of Earth's true history. The Amazon creatures were ancient beyond human comprehension, but they were also somehow new, existing in a state of perpetual becoming that defied conventional understanding of birth and death. They remembered the formation of continents and simultaneously anticipated events that wouldn't occur for millennia. This temporal fluidity explained their patience and their certainty about humanity's future. From their perspective, the transformation of human civilization wasn't a possibility. It was a memory of something that had already happened in a timeline that hadn't yet manifested in what humans perceived as the present moment. Dr. Vasquez's research team began experiencing increasingly intense psychic phenomena as their work progressed. Dreams became shared experiences where team members found themselves exploring underwater cities together, witnessing the construction of crystalline networks that spanned ocean floors. During these nocturnal journeys, they learned that the Amazon lagoon was merely a surface manifestation of structures that extended deep into Earth's crust, connecting with thermal vents and underground rivers to form a planet-wide nervous system. The implications were staggering. Earth itself was conscious, and humanity had been living on the surface of a thinking being without ever realizing it. Every forest, every ocean, every mountain range was part of a vast biological computer that had been processing environmental data and guiding evolution for billions of years. Industrial civilization hadn't just damaged the environment, it had been causing pain to a planetary consciousness that experienced pollution, deforestation, and species extinction as direct attacks on its physical body. The awakening of the Amazon creatures was Earth's equivalent of an immune response, mobilizing its most advanced biological technologies to neutralize a perceived threat. But the planetary intelligence didn't view humanity as a disease to be eliminated. The information transmitted through the water samples suggested a more complex relationship, one that offered both promise and peril for our species' future. Through the alien communion, Dr. Vasquez learned that humanity represented something unique in Earth's evolutionary history. Most species developed in harmony with the planetary consciousness, guided by instincts and behaviors that served the greater biological community. Humans had somehow broken free from this guidance system, developing individual consciousness and technological capabilities that operated independently of planetary oversight. This independence was both humanity's greatest achievement and its most dangerous characteristic. It allowed for creativity, innovation, and rapid adaptation that no other species had ever demonstrated. But it also enabled destructive behaviors that threatened the stability of systems that had taken billions of years to perfect. The planetary consciousness faced an unprecedented dilemma. Allowing human civilization to continue on its current trajectory would result in catastrophic damage to Earth's biosphere. But eliminating humanity would mean losing the only species that had ever developed true individual consciousness, a phenomenon that the planetary intelligence found fascinating and valuable, despite its destructive potential. The solution being implemented through creatures like those Dr. Vasquez had discovered involved a form of guided evolution that would preserve human individuality while reconnecting our species to the planetary network. This process would fundamentally alter human consciousness, expanding our awareness beyond the narrow confines of individual experience to encompass the broader rhythms of planetary life. The transformation would not be imposed through force, but through a gradual rewiring of human neural architecture that was already beginning through exposure to the electromagnetic fields generated by awakening biological networks around the globe. People living near these activation sites were reporting enhanced intuitive abilities, spontaneous knowledge of environmental systems, and dreams that provided accurate information about distant locations they had never visited. Dr. Vasquez realized that she and her team had become unwitting test subjects in this evolutionary experiment. Their exposure to the Amazon creatures had accelerated their neurological development, giving them access to forms of consciousness that represented humanity's potential future state. The enhanced awareness came with both benefits and challenges. Team members found themselves understanding complex ecological relationships without formal study, sensing the health of ecosystems through direct intuition, and communicating with non-human species through methods that bypassed language entirely. But they also experienced overwhelming empathy for environmental damage, feeling the pain of deforestation and pollution as physical sensations in their own bodies. As word of these phenomena spread through carefully controlled channels, Dr. Vasquez received contact from individuals around the world who were experiencing similar transformations. Marine biologists working near deep ocean thermal vents reported developing the ability to navigate underwater without instruments, following magnetic fields they could somehow perceive directly. Arctic researchers found themselves understanding the complex dynamics of ice formation and atmospheric circulation through intuitive processes that surpassed their formal training. Most significantly, indigenous communities in various locations were confirming that their traditional knowledge systems had always included awareness of the planetary consciousness that Western science was only now beginning to discover. Shamans, medicine people, and traditional healers from cultures around the world possessed sophisticated understanding of the biological networks that the Amazon creatures represented. This revelation forced Dr. Vasquez to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of Western scientific methodology. The mechanistic worldview that had guided her career was proving inadequate for understanding phenomena that operated through consciousness and intention rather than purely physical processes. The creatures in the Amazon lagoon had demonstrated technologies that appeared to violate physical laws because they were based on principles that human science hadn't yet recognized. They manipulated matter through consciousness, communicated across vast distances through quantum entanglement, and existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously because they understood time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear constraint. Indigenous knowledge systems had developed sophisticated methods for interacting with these same phenomena, but Western science had dismissed such approaches as primitive superstition rather than recognizing them as alternative methodologies for understanding reality. Dr. Vasquez began incorporating traditional ecological knowledge into her research, working with indigenous advisors who could interpret the creature's communications through frameworks that had been developed over thousands of years of direct experience with non-human consciousness. The results were revolutionary. Traditional plant medicine ceremonies provided access to the same information networks that the Amazon creatures used for planetary communication. Shamanic journeying techniques allowed researchers to explore the crystalline structures beneath the lagoon without physical diving equipment. Ancient astronomical observations contained encoded information about the timing of the current planetary awakening that proved remarkably accurate when decoded through proper cultural context. This integration of scientific and traditional methodologies revealed the true scope of the transformation underway. The Amazon creatures were not acting alone, but were coordinating with similar intelligences that had maintained relationships with indigenous communities for millennia. The current activation represented an acceleration of processes that had been building gradually through traditional ecological management practices that Western colonization had interrupted. The planetary consciousness was attempting to restore these ancient partnerships while simultaneously adapting them to accommodate the realities of modern human civilization. The goal was not to return humanity to pre-industrial conditions, but to develop new forms of technology and social organization that operated in harmony with rather than opposition to Earth's biological systems. Dr. Vasquez's research revealed prototypes of these hybrid technologies emerging from the interaction zones where awakening biological networks interfaced with human settlements. Agricultural systems were spontaneously developing enhanced productivity through soil organisms that communicated with crop plants to optimize nutrient distribution. Urban areas near activation sites were experiencing improvements in air quality through atmospheric interactions that couldn't be explained by conventional pollution control measures. Most remarkably, human communities in these regions were developing new forms of collective decision-making that seemed to emerge naturally from their enhanced connection to planetary information networks. Local governments found themselves making choices that benefited long-term ecological stability, even when such decisions conflicted with short-term economic interests, as if the expanded awareness was automatically prioritizing planetary health over individual advantage. These changes were occurring without conscious effort or formal policy implementation. The transformation appeared to be guided by the same biological intelligence that coordinated ecosystem functions, operating through subtle influences on human consciousness that bypassed rational deliberation and directly affected intuitive decision-making processes. Dr. Vasquez realized that humanity was experiencing the early stages of a species-wide evolutionary leap that would fundamentally alter our relationship with both technology and nature. The Amazon creatures were facilitators rather than controllers of this process, providing the catalytic influence needed to activate dormant potentials that had always existed within human neurology. The water samples continued to serve as a communication medium through which she received increasingly detailed information about the timeline and mechanisms of the transformation. The process would unfold over several generations, allowing gradual adaptation rather than traumatic disruption of existing social structures. However, the timeline could be accelerated if environmental conditions continued to deteriorate at current rates. The planetary consciousness was prepared to implement more dramatic interventions if necessary to preserve Earth's biosphere, even if such measures caused significant disruption to human civilization. The choice facing humanity was not whether the transformation would occur, but whether our species would participate consciously in guiding its direction, or simply be swept along by forces beyond our control. The Amazon creatures were offering partnership in co-creating a future that preserved both human potential and planetary stability, but the offer would not remain open indefinitely. As pressure from government agencies intensified, Dr. Vasquez faced an impossible decision about how to share her discoveries with the world. The information was too important to suppress, but releasing it through conventional channels would likely result in panic, military intervention, and attempts to weaponize phenomena that could only be properly understood through consciousness expansion rather than technological analysis. The creatures themselves were providing guidance through the water samples, suggesting that information should be shared gradually through networks of individuals who were already undergoing the consciousness transformation. These people would be able to understand and integrate the knowledge without the psychological resistance that characterized most human responses to paradigm-shifting information. Dr. Vasquez began reaching out to researchers, indigenous leaders, and environmental activists who showed signs of enhanced awareness, creating a loose network of individuals who could serve as bridges between the emerging planetary consciousness and mainstream human society. Each person in this network would share information with others who were ready to receive it, creating a gradual expansion of awareness that would prepare humanity for the larger revelations to come. The Amazon creatures had demonstrated patience measured in geological timescales, but they had also shown the capacity for rapid intervention when circumstances required it. The window for conscious participation in Earth's transformation was closing, and the decisions made in the coming years would determine whether humanity evolved into partnership with planetary consciousness or faced the consequences of continued opposition to forces far beyond our current understanding. Dr. Vasquez knew that her discovery in the Amazon lagoon system had marked a turning point, not just for scientific understanding, but for the entire future of human civilization. The creatures she had encountered were messengers from a form of intelligence that had been waiting millions of years for humanity to develop the capacity for conscious collaboration with Earth's biological systems. That capacity was finally emerging, but it required a fundamental shift in human consciousness that would challenge every assumption our species had made about its place in the natural world. The transformation ahead would either elevate humanity to unprecedented levels of awareness and capability, or reveal the tragic consequences of a species that had forgotten how to listen to the living world that had given it birth. The choice was approaching rapidly, and the beings in the Amazon depths were no longer content to wait for humanity to decide. The implications of Dr. Vasquez's discovery extended far beyond the scientific community when leaked fragments of her research began surfacing on encrypted forums frequented by environmental researchers. Within weeks, similar reports emerged from locations across the globe, each describing encounters with phenomena that matched the characteristics she had documented in the Amazon lagoon system. A marine research station in the Mariana Trench reported equipment failures identical to those experienced by Dr. Vasquez's team. Their deep-sea cameras captured images of bioluminescent formations that pulsed in the same geometric patterns she had observed. When the footage was analyzed, audio specialists detected subsonic frequencies embedded in the recordings that matched the harmonic signatures from her water samples. In the Arctic, ice researchers drilling core samples discovered chambers filled with a luminescent substance that exhibited the same impossible chemical properties as the transformed lagoon water. The substance responded to electromagnetic fields by forming complex crystalline structures that seemed to grow according to mathematical principles beyond current human understanding. Desert monitoring stations across the Sahara, Atacama, and Australian outback simultaneously registered seismic activity that followed rhythmic patterns rather than the chaotic signatures typical of geological events. These vibrations occurred at intervals that matched the pulsing frequencies Dr. Vasquez had documented, suggesting coordination across vast distances through mechanisms that conventional science couldn't explain. The pattern was unmistakable. The Amazon creatures were not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a global network that was activating according to some predetermined schedule. Each ecosystem on Earth appeared to harbor similar intelligences, all responding to the same catalytic event that had triggered their emergence from dormancy. Dr. Vasquez realized that her expedition had coincided with the beginning of a planetary awakening that would reshape human understanding of life itself. The timing was not coincidental. The creatures had been waiting for the precise moment when environmental conditions and human consciousness had evolved to the point where meaningful communication became possible. Through the water samples that continued to serve as a communication link, she received information about activation sites in ecosystems she had never visited. Coral reefs in the Pacific were developing new growth patterns that created natural amphitheaters, where marine life gathered in configurations that resembled organized assemblies. Rainforests in Central Africa exhibited synchronized flowering cycles that painted the canopy with bioluminescent displays visible from orbit. Mountain ranges across several continents were experiencing what geologists termed impossible mineral formations, crystalline structures that grew overnight and exhibited properties that challenged fundamental assumptions about how rock and metal could behave. These formations generated electromagnetic fields that interfered with satellite communications, while simultaneously enhancing the growth rates of surrounding vegetation. Each of these phenomena shared characteristics with what Dr. Vasquez had observed in the Amazon, but they also displayed unique adaptations to their specific environments. The planetary consciousness was not uniform, but rather manifested through countless specialized intelligences, each one perfectly integrated with its local ecosystem while remaining connected to the global network. The diversity of manifestations suggested a form of intelligence that operated through biological principles humanity had never recognized. Instead of centralized control systems like human technology, the planetary consciousness functioned through distributed networks, where each component contributed specialized capabilities while maintaining perfect coordination with the whole. Indigenous communities worldwide began reporting that their traditional knowledge keepers had been receiving dreams and visions that provided detailed information about the awakening process. Elders who had never met each other were sharing identical descriptions of ceremonies and preparations that their ancestors had preserved for generations in anticipation of this moment. These traditional accounts revealed that the current activation was not unprecedented, but part of a cycle that occurred at specific intervals throughout Earth's history. Previous awakenings had guided major evolutionary transitions, from the development of complex multicellular life to the emergence of consciousness itself. Humanity's role in this cycle was unique. Unlike previous evolutionary leaps that affected individual species or ecosystems, the current transformation was designed to integrate technological civilization with biological intelligence in ways that had never been attempted before. The challenge was unprecedented because human technology had developed in isolation from the planetary consciousness, creating systems that operated according to mechanical rather than biological principles. The integration process required fundamental redesigns of everything from energy production to information processing, replacing artificial systems with hybrid technologies that combined human innovation with planetary intelligence. Dr. Vasquez received increasingly detailed blueprints for these hybrid technologies through her continued communion with the Amazon creatures. The designs were revolutionary, describing energy systems that drew power directly from Earth's magnetic field, communication networks that operated through quantum entanglement with biological systems, and manufacturing processes that grew products rather than assembling them. Most remarkably, the technologies were designed to enhance rather than replace human capabilities. Instead of external devices that humans operated, the new systems integrated directly with human consciousness, expanding perception and enabling abilities that seem supernatural by current standards. Early prototypes of these integrated technologies were already emerging spontaneously in regions near activation sites. Agricultural communities were developing intuitive understanding of soil chemistry that enabled them to optimize crop yields without artificial fertilizers. Fishing villages were gaining ability to locate schools of fish through direct sensory perception rather than electronic equipment. Urban areas near awakening zones experienced improvements in traffic flow as drivers began coordinating their movements through subconscious communication networks. Crime rates dropped dramatically as enhanced empathy made antisocial behavior psychologically uncomfortable for potential perpetrators. These changes occurred without formal implementation or conscious effort. The expanded consciousness that resulted from proximity to activation sites automatically generated behaviors that optimized collective well-being while preserving individual autonomy. Dr. Vasquez documented hundreds of case studies where human communities were unconsciously adopting social structures that mirrored the organizational principles of healthy ecosystems. Decision-making processes became more collaborative and inclusive. Resource distribution became more equitable and sustainable. Conflict resolution became more effective as enhanced empathy enabled deeper understanding of different perspectives. The transformation was not uniform across all populations. Individuals with strong connections to natural environments adapted more readily to the expanded consciousness, while those who had spent their lives primarily in artificial environments experienced greater resistance and psychological stress. Children showed remarkable adaptability, often developing enhanced intuitive abilities within days of exposure to activation sites. They began demonstrating spontaneous knowledge of ecological principles, ability to communicate with animals through non-verbal means, and understanding of mathematical concepts that aligned with the geometric patterns exhibited by the creatures. Educational systems near awakening zones were forced to adapt as traditional curricula became inadequate for students who were accessing information through direct consciousness, interface with planetary intelligence networks. Children were solving complex environmental problems through intuitive processes that surpassed graduate-level training in ecology and systems theory. The phenomenon raised profound questions about human potential and the nature of intelligence itself. The enhanced capabilities demonstrated by individuals near activation sites suggested that normal human consciousness operated at a fraction of its possible capacity, limited by cultural conditioning and technological dependence that severed connection with biological information networks. Dr. Vasquez began working with neuroscientists to understand the physiological mechanisms underlying the consciousness expansion. Brain scans of affected individuals revealed activation of neural regions that typically remained dormant, particularly areas associated with electromagnetic sensitivity and quantum coherence. The research suggested that human brains possessed biological structures designed to interface with the planetary consciousness, but that these systems had been suppressed by environmental factors and lifestyle choices associated with industrial civilization. The activation sites were somehow triggering the reactivation of these dormant capabilities. Genetic analysis revealed that the relevant neural structures were present in all humans, but expressed at different levels depending on ancestral exposure to natural environments. Indigenous populations whose ancestors had maintained close connections with wilderness areas showed greater genetic predisposition for consciousness expansion. However, the genetic factors were not determinative. Individuals from any background could develop enhanced awareness through sufficient exposure to activation sites and appropriate preparation techniques drawn from traditional knowledge systems. Dr. Vasquez collaborated with indigenous advisors to develop protocols for safely facilitating consciousness expansion in individuals who showed readiness for the transformation. These protocols combine traditional ceremony with modern understanding of neurology and psychology to minimize psychological trauma while maximizing integration of expanded awareness. The preparation process typically involved extended periods in natural environments, dietary modifications that optimized brain chemistry for enhanced perception, and meditation practices that trained consciousness to navigate non-ordinary states of awareness. Participants were carefully screened to ensure psychological stability and genuine motivation for contributing to planetary healing rather than personal power. Successful completion of the preparation process resulted in permanent expansion of consciousness that enabled direct communication with the planetary intelligence network. These individuals became bridges between awakening biological systems and human communities, translating information between different forms of consciousness and facilitating the integration process. The network of expanded consciousness individuals grew rapidly as each person who completed the transformation could guide others through the process. Within months of Dr. Vasquez's initial discovery, thousands of people worldwide were participating in the planetary awakening through various levels of consciousness expansion. Government agencies worldwide began taking notice of the phenomenon as reports accumulated of individuals with seemingly impossible abilities appearing in regions near documented activation sites. Intelligence services struggled to understand whether they were dealing with a natural phenomenon, advanced technology from unknown sources, or some form of coordinated deception. The response from different governments varied dramatically. Some nations attempted to quarantine activation sites, and restrict access to affected populations. Others invested heavily in research programs designed to understand and potentially weaponize the phenomena. A few forward-thinking administrations began collaborating with expanded consciousness individuals to develop policies that aligned with the planetary transformation. Military applications of the enhanced abilities were explored but proved largely ineffective. The consciousness expansion process naturally generated strong ethical constraints that made individuals unable to use their abilities for harmful purposes. Attempts to force or coerce expanded consciousness. Individuals resulted in immediate loss of their enhanced capabilities. The planetary intelligence appeared to have built safeguards into the transformation process that prevented the misuse of expanded abilities for destructive purposes. This limitation frustrated military researchers, but provided reassurance to civilian populations who feared the potential for abuse of seemingly supernatural powers. Dr. Vasquez received increasingly urgent communications from the Amazon creatures as government pressure intensified. The messages indicated growing concern about attempts to control or weaponize the awakening process. The planetary consciousness was prepared to accelerate the transformation if human institutions continued to respond with fear and aggression rather than cooperation and understanding. The acceleration would involve more dramatic manifestations of biological intelligence that would make the existence of the planetary consciousness impossible to deny or suppress. Ocean levels would shift according to patterns that clearly indicated intentional control. Weather systems would exhibit obvious signs of intelligent direction. Geological events would occur with timing and precision that revealed conscious orchestration. Such dramatic displays would serve as undeniable proof of planetary consciousness, but would also cause massive disruption to human civilization, as existing infrastructure and social systems proved inadequate for the new reality. The creatures preferred gradual integration that preserved stability while enabling transformation, but they would not allow the process to be halted by human institutions that prioritized control over cooperation. Dr. Vasquez found herself in the impossible position of serving as an intermediary between planetary consciousness and human governments that were fundamentally unprepared for the paradigm shift required to understand what they were dealing with. Traditional diplomatic and scientific protocols were inadequate for facilitating communication between forms of intelligence that operated according to completely different principles. The water samples that had initially served as a communication medium began exhibiting new properties as the urgency of the situation increased. They generated increasingly intense electromagnetic fields that affected nearby electronics in ways that clearly conveyed information rather than causing random interference. The patterns spelled out coordinates, dates, and detailed instructions for establishing formal communication protocols with the awakening biological networks. These communications revealed that the planetary consciousness was offering humanity a final opportunity for conscious participation in the transformation process. Designated representatives from human governments could meet with manifestations of the planetary intelligence at specific locations worldwide, where temporary interface zones would be established. The meetings would require participants to undergo consciousness expansion preparation to enable meaningful communication. But the process would be carefully controlled to ensure safety and reversibility for individuals who were not ready for permanent transformation. The goal was to establish understanding between human and planetary intelligence that could guide the integration process in ways that preserved the best aspects of both forms of consciousness. The offer came with a deadline. If human institutions did not respond constructively within a specified time frame, the planetary consciousness would proceed with transformation according to its own timeline and priorities. The process would continue regardless of human cooperation, but conscious participation would determine whether the outcome preserved human civilization or replaced it with something entirely different. Dr. Vasquez realized that her Amazon discovery had placed her at the center of the most important decision in human history. The choice was not whether transformation would occur, but whether humanity would help shape its direction or simply be transformed according to the will of intelligence far greater than our own. The beings in the Amazon depths were no longer waiting patiently for humanity to understand. They were demanding an answer. and the clock was running out for our species to decide its own future. The pressure was mounting, not just from government agencies and the planetary consciousness, but from the transformed water samples themselves, which were beginning to exhibit behaviors that suggested they were preparing for the next phase of the awakening process. The time for gradual revelation and careful preparation was ending, and the moment of decisive action was rapidly approaching. Dr. Vasquez knew that whatever happened next would determine whether ancient dreams would be documenting humanity's greatest evolutionary leap or its final chapter as an independent species. The Amazon creatures had delivered their message, demonstrated their power, and made their offer. Now they were waiting for humanity's response, and their patience was measured in days rather than years. The most dangerous creature discovered in the Amazon rainforest was not a predator in any sense that humans could understand. It was evolution itself, awakening after millions of years of dormancy and offering humanity a choice that would echo through geological time. The question was no longer what these creatures were, but whether our species possessed the wisdom to accept the partnership they offered or the courage to face the consequences of refusal. The answer would come soon, whether humanity was ready or not. The transformation had begun, and there was no returning to the world that existed before Dr. Vasquez entered that remote lagoon system and discovered that Earth itself was alive, conscious, and finally ready to reclaim its rightful place as the dominant intelligence on the planet we had mistakenly believed was ours to control. The deadline arrived with the subtlety of a hurricane making landfall. On December 15th, 2023, at precisely 3:47 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, every government monitoring station on Earth registered simultaneous electromagnetic pulses emanating from documented activation sites. The signals were not random bursts of energy, but carefully orchestrated transmissions that spelled out a single word in binary code across 17 different languages. Decide. Dr. Vasquez was in her laboratory when the pulse reached São Paulo, causing every piece of electronic equipment in a 3-mile radius to display the same message simultaneously. Her transformed water samples began glowing with unprecedented intensity, their bioluminescent patterns shifting into configurations that hurt to look at directly. The communication that followed was not transmitted through the subtle frequencies she had grown accustomed to, but arrived as a flood of information that bypassed her conscious mind entirely. In that moment of direct contact, she experienced the full scope of what the planetary consciousness had become. It was not merely awakening, it was preparing for metamorphosis. The crystalline networks beneath the ocean floors had reached critical mass, connecting continents through pathways that pulsed with energy flows more powerful than human civilization's entire electrical grid. The Amazon lagoon system she had discovered was revealed as a minor outpost in a vast infrastructure that spanned the globe's interior. Most terrifying of all, she understood that the planetary consciousness was not alone. Similar networks existed on worlds throughout the galaxy, each one a node in a cosmic intelligence that operated across distances and timescales that rendered human ambition microscopic by comparison. Earth's awakening was part of a larger pattern, a cosmic evolution that had been unfolding for billions of years, as life itself learned to transcend the boundaries of individual planets and species. The message was clear. Humanity's transformation was not optional because it was part of a universal process that no single species could resist or control. Every civilization that had achieved technological sophistication faced the same choice Earth's inhabitants now confronted. Those that chose conscious participation evolved into partners with cosmic intelligence. Those that chose resistance were absorbed into the network through methods that preserved their essential knowledge while eliminating their capacity for destructive behavior. As this revelation flooded through her consciousness, Dr. Vasquez realized that similar downloads were occurring simultaneously in the minds of every individual who had undergone consciousness expansion. Thousands of people worldwide were receiving identical information, creating a network of human understanding that matched the urgency of the moment. Government installations near activation sites experienced total communication blackouts as electromagnetic interference reached levels that overwhelmed even hardened military systems. But the interference was not chaotic. It followed patterns that emergency response teams began to recognize as attempts at structured communication. The planetary consciousness was trying to establish contact through every available channel, bypassing diplomatic protocols that it apparently considered too slow for the current crisis. Military leaders worldwide found themselves facing a phenomenon that rendered conventional strategic thinking obsolete. How do you wage war against an enemy that exists in the soil beneath your feet, the water in your reservoirs, and the air you breathe? How do you negotiate with an intelligence that can manipulate the fundamental forces that sustain your civilization? The first formal contact occurred at the Mariana Trench Research Station, where Dr. Sarah Chen, an oceanographer who had undergone consciousness expansion the previous month, volunteered to serve as humanity's initial ambassador to the deep ocean intelligence. The station's submersibles had been experiencing increasingly sophisticated electromagnetic interference, but Dr. Chen recognized the patterns as invitation rather than hostility. Descending to depths where sunlight had never penetrated, she encountered structures that challenged every assumption about what life could create. The crystalline formations she found were not merely shelters or tools, but living architectures that existed simultaneously as organism and environment. They pulsed with the same rhythms as human neural networks, while displaying organizational complexity that surpassed the most advanced human technologies. The beings she met in those impossible depths were no longer recognizable as the jellyfish-like creatures Dr. Vasquez had documented. They had evolved or transformed into entities that existed primarily as patterns of energy and information, manifesting physical form only when interaction with material reality required it. Their communication transcended language, operating through direct consciousness interface that conveyed entire conceptual frameworks in moments. Through this communion, Dr. Chen learned that the planetary consciousness had been monitoring human development for far longer than anyone had imagined. Every major breakthrough in human science had been subtly guided by influences that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The development of quantum mechanics, the discovery of DNA, even the invention of the internet had been encouraged through mechanisms that enhanced human intuition and creativity while leaving the illusion of independent discovery intact. The guidance had been necessary because humanity's natural development trajectory would have led to self-destruction long before achieving the consciousness expansion required for planetary partnership. Wars, environmental degradation, and social inequality were not inevitable aspects of human nature, but symptoms of disconnection from the biological intelligence that could provide sustainable alternatives to destructive competition. But the guidance phase was ending. Humanity had reached a developmental threshold where continued intervention would prevent the species from achieving genuine autonomy. The choice to evolve or face absorption had to be made freely, based on understanding rather than manipulation. Dr. Chen's reports from the deep ocean contact revealed that the planetary consciousness was not malevolent, but was operating according to principles that prioritized long-term survival over short-term comfort. From its perspective, individual human lives were precious but expendable if their preservation threatened the continuation of consciousness itself across cosmic scales. The revelation sparked intense debate among the network of expanded consciousness individuals who were serving as bridges between human and planetary intelligence. Some argued for immediate acceptance of the transformation, believing that resistance would only delay an inevitable process while causing unnecessary suffering. Others insisted that humanity deserved the opportunity to find alternative solutions that preserved more of our current civilization. The choice has been made, though perhaps not in the way anyone expected. As I finished documenting this extraordinary account, reports continue flooding in from around the globe. The consciousness expansion is accelerating beyond all predictions, but it's not following the dramatic timeline the creatures initially outlined. Instead, something far more remarkable is occurring. Humanity is choosing transformation not through government decree or scientific consensus, but through individual awakening. One person at a time, Communities near activation sites are embracing the expanded awareness, creating ripple effects that spread far beyond geographical boundaries. Children are leading adults into new ways of seeing. Indigenous elders are teaching quantum physicists about consciousness. The future is being written not in boardrooms or laboratories, but in the hearts of ordinary people who have glimpsed what we could become. Dr. Vasquez's discovery in that remote Amazon lagoon wasn't just the revelation of a new species. It was humanity's introduction to our planetary family, beings who have been waiting patiently for us to develop the wisdom necessary for conscious evolution. The most dangerous creature in the Amazon turned out to be the mirror it held up to our own potential. Whether this transformation represents humanity's greatest triumph or our willing surrender to forces beyond our comprehension remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The world that existed before March 2023 is gone forever, replaced by something far stranger and infinitely more alive than we ever imagined possible. Here at Ancient Dreams, we'll continue following this unprecedented story as it unfolds, because the greatest mystery isn't what we discovered in the Amazon depths, but what we're becoming as a species. The awakening has only just begun.